Hey guys, so this is going to be the first deck that I'm featuring, doing kind of a special edition mini-series on PureMTGO.com, taking a look not only at the different mechanics that we have been granted, spell mechanics through Magic the Gathering, but kind of seeing if I can put together decks that have a focus about these mechanics, and do so on a budget. So this is going to be the first one. The first thing I wanted to deal with was Graft. I had built several versions of this deck, and I've always had a lot of fun with it, even if it doesn't win. It's one of these things that, you know, every once in a while, I'm sure other Magic players get into this. You get tired of the game, and you kind of just hit a slump basically. And Graft is always this deck. You know, in any form that I've run it, has been something that I've come back to kind of re-interest myself and regain some of that momentum and energy that I've had when it comes to playing this game. So Graft is a mechanical, I want to talk about real quick, that was introduced to us in Ravnica Block. More importantly, it came in Dissension, and it was really related to the Simic Guild, which was green and blue and related with, this whole mechanic with these, I don't know, mutants, whatever you want to call it. I guess that they are mutants because that's the tribe type as well. And kind of all these experiments with creatures and whatnot that was going on. I won't get too much into the flavor and whatnot, but Graft is a mechanic. All these creatures, right? You see, they have Graft, and then that is followed by a number. So what happens is these creatures are essentially 0/0 creatures. Now they enter the battlefield, and Graft is actually, interestingly enough, it is a static and a triggered ability at the same time. So let's take a look at the Hydropon here. It says Graft 5. Now this creature, you pay the cost, and it is a 0/0 creature, but it enters the battlefield with 5+1/+1 counters. Essentially makes this creature a 5/5 creature. But its power and toughness are completely related along the fact that those are +1/+1 counters. Now, Graft's triggered ability is whenever another creature comes into play, no matter whose creature it is, your opponent's or your own, when any other creature in the game state enters the battlefield, the Graft mechanic is triggered, and you have the choice to, click yes or no, and choose to move a +1/+1 counter from that creature, so from this Hydropon, onto the new creature that just entered the battlefield. This is, a great thing. If you go to the article, you read it. I have kind of spelled out all the detailed rules. There's a couple interesting interactions when it comes to Graft regarding stuff like when a creature with Graft and a creature without Graft enter the battlefield simultaneously. So if you want the details of how it works, definitely go over to puremtgo.com and check out my article. But I just wanted to give you kind of a quick segue there, a quick introduction to the mechanic itself. Now, a lot of creatures did have other abilities. You see the Rootkin does, the Frogling, in addition to Graft, that kind of related to Graft. For example, we take a look at the Plaxcaster Frogling. You pay 2 colorless mana, and target creature with a +1/+1 counter gets Shroud until end of turn. So it was really this whole mechanic based around these counters. Now, we had also seen kind of another introduction, an interesting introduction, in Time Spiral Block, and that came with Llanowar Reborn. Now, this is a land that produces green mana, but it also has Graft. So this land enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can move that counter. The Graft still triggers. Whenever a creature comes into play, you have the option to move that counter from Llanowar Reborn onto the creature that just entered the battlefield. Now, we also got another great creature in Time Spiral Block, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what also came around is later on in Scars of Mirrodin, we were introduced to this other mechanic called Proliferate. Now, Proliferate is not something that I am going to be building a specific deck around. Yes, it is a spell mechanic, and maybe if I run into an issue, I'll scrap a deck that I'm working on and focus on Proliferate, but it doesn't really work as a main focus because it does rely on other counters to be moved and added. And what Proliferate basically does is when a spell or whatever is resolved that says Proliferate, is you choose any number of permanents with any counter type on them, and you can add an additional counter of that type to that permanent. So that enters into some fun interactions. But let's take a look at kind of the card choices. Another thing I want to point out, and I do mention this at the end of my little section on Graft, is the fact that this deck is not only classic legal, but it is also tribal legal. This is actually mutant tribal. It is running 22 creatures. You see the behemoth is not a mutant, but that's okay because it is 22 creatures, so you still fall in those boundaries. Um, so if you find yourself in a tribal setting, you can take this deck out as well. A quick note as well, I am building these decks on a budget. Budget I'm shooting for with each deck is about $20. I figure that's a pretty good mark. People can usually afford $20. I mean, that's I think it's a reasonable mark. This deck is broken down on Pure as far as the card prices for each. That is looking at mtgotraders.com, and this deck actually costs only $10 to put together. So that's definitely a plus. The most expensive card, and if you were getting rid of something, is the Hinterland Harbors. They are getting close to $2 a piece now. Actually, when I first built this deck and started working on this series, the Harbors were about $1 a piece. There's been a lot of recent articles about speculation, and there's been a lot of speculation regarding the importance of blue and green in a later deck. As we get this next block introduced and whatnot. So those are going up a little bit in price. If you do want to have interest in building this, you can either decide to cut those or jump on the opportunity to get those while you can. I think it's even with those price raising a little bit, it's not going to be anything too troublesome because this deck is still only $10. So that as that goes up, you're still under the $20 limit. But anyways, let's focus on the deck here. So we are running, Mutant Tribal. Obviously, you're going to run 4 copies of Cytoplast Rootkin. This is almost like the Graft Lord, is what I like to call him. He has Graft 4, so he has a 4/4 for 4. And when he enters the battlefield, he adds another +1/+1 counter to every creature that already has a +1/+1 counter on it. This is fantastic even outside of Graft. You can work some great things with that. Another interesting thing that you can do with this creature is it has an ability where you can pay 2 colorless mana, and you can move a +1/+1 counter from any creature with a counter on it to the Rootkin. So you're not moving them around on other creatures, you're just basically drawing them from others onto this specific creature. So he's like I said, the Graft Lord. He was a rare. Used to be much more expensive. Has gone down significantly now that blocks have rotated. I was loving that. Next up on the list is the Hydropon. This is kind of an interesting creature. It is essentially a 5/5 for 3, but it cannot attack or block. So that makes it basically just a stick. I call it the Graft stick. It's basically the same thing as an enchantment. It just sits there, and the only point of it is to have Graft. You want to be able to play this before other creatures, so that when other creatures come into play, they can steal from the Hydropon. I use a lot of times the Rootkin to draw from the Hydropon. It's basically all it is a permanent that has counters, and you're just drawing from it almost endlessly with this deck. Next creature on the list is the Plaxcaster Frogling. I definitely love this guy. It is a 3/of at least. It is a 3/3 for 3. Great, cost to mana. Cost to power ratio. And his ability is pay 2 colorless, like I said, and any creature with a counter gets Shroud. It's kind of great to have these creatures in the deck. This Graft mechanic allows me to pay 2 off the Frogling to protect, say, a Simic Initiate, which works great. If I've pumped one creature up significantly more than the others, I can still protect it if I have a Frogling in play. Next up is a full set of Simic Initiates. I felt this is good. It gives you a 1-drop. Kind of gets that aggro going faster. Actually, a lot of these Graft creatures come in at low cost. There are some that I have left out, mostly the blue ones, because I just felt they didn't fit the theme. Blue is really more of a splash in this deck. In most cases, with Terramorphics and stuff, you're going to want to grab green land. You only need about 1 island in play at any point in time. So the Initiates I thought was kind of a good costed, cost to attack ratio creature to get in the early game, get the mana curve worked out. Next up on the block is a full set of spiders, and these have been the bane of my existence. I love these guys. These are the best of the, I guess, the common Graft creatures. It is a 2/2 for 2. And it has pay 1 green, and target creature with a counter, a +1/+1 counter, can block as though it had flying. It gains reach. So I said these have been the bane. I love these things. They're fantastic. It's going to be one of your best early game drops. but I found myself in multiple games recently. You see, I'm running a full set of these and needed to block flyers and could not find one. So very disheartening, but they are in there. They are definitely useful. Don't underestimate that ability for giving a creature reach. Next Graft creature is 2 copies of Sporeback Troll. This card, it's only running 2 of. It is a common, and I kind of devalued it a bit because you are paying 4 mana for a 2/2 creature, which is very not fun in my books. He is nice because he does give you that pay 2 and regenerate creature with a +1/+1 counter, which is really nice. But the fact that, again, it's a 4 for 2 really holds it back. If there was something else that I wanted to put in, I would at least run one of these so that I had his ability. But I figured 2 is a nice way to end up drawing it, increasing my odds of drawing it. Sorry, I know I'm kind of stumbling over words here, but try saying +1/+1 counter a million times, and you'll understand where it's going on. So next up, this is the other bomb. Cytoplast Rootkin is really your biggest bomb. The Frog is your kind of control and protect your bombs. And the other one is the Fungal Behemoth. Now this is the other one I was saying was printed in Time Spiral block and absolutely is made for a Graft deck. If you remember the suspend mechanic, this has suspend X, and this was a cycle of creatures that you could suspend, and every time a counter was removed, they did something. Now the Fungal Behemoth every turn is going to, when suspended, add a +1/+1 counter to target creature, which is fantastic. But what you'll find actually most of all with this deck is you even want to just hardcast this for 4. There's a lot of times, suspending it is great, but a lot of times I just want to put it into play. If you've started off with 2 Spite or something like that, you're right there looking at 4, and he's a 4/4 creature. If you start out, Simic Initiate into Hydropon, right now the Behemoth is a 6/6 for 4. So you can definitely find that when you draw these, you want to get those into play usually as fast as possible. Another thing that's very important with the Behemoth, and I like to keep pointing out, is when it comes into play, I don't care where you take that Graft token from, but you want to get a +1/+1 counter onto this Behemoth. What that does is it allows the Rootkin to increase the Behemoth size when it comes into play, because it will have a +1/+1 counter on it, and the Rootkin's ability will give it a second. That second is going to actually give him +2/+2 because it's a second counter, so it's going to add to his life count, as well as giving him +1/+1. So something to keep in mind. These are really your bombs. Maybe even could be increased to a 3rd copy, and taking out a troll if you so wanted. But these are very cheap cards. Like I said, the whole deck is only $10. You can feel free to play around with it as you want. So that covers the creature base. Let's take a quick look at some of the other things. I talked about the use of Proliferate. I really didn't want to overload the deck with these. There's a lot of stuff in blue and green that gives you some options. I didn't want to overload the deck with this. I'm running 2 copies of the Contagion Clasp. Now this is in the deck not so much for control. I mean, if you notice, this deck is kind of your typical mono green deck, where it's not running creature control. You're going to try and control creatures by just aggroing, blocking, and being smart in combat. So the -1/-1 counter that it gives when it comes into play is not terribly important. It will occasionally kill off some creatures here and there. Notice that it has to be played. That -1/-1 counter has to be played. So if your opponent does not have any creatures, you will need to put it on your own creature when that comes into play. But what I really wanted is the fact that it is a reusable Proliferate. This is a permanent, so I can use it every turn, pay that 4, and Proliferate, which is great. If you get a couple creatures, you got the mana, you got that in play. Every turn your creatures are getting one size bigger, and that's great. The other card that I went for with the Proliferate is Tezzeret's Gambit. There are 2 draw spells with Proliferate. This one is the one I chose. Draw 2 cards and Proliferate. I chose it because you have the ability to not need the blue. You can just pay this for 3 green and 2 life, and get that going. I really wasn't I expected more out of the draw spells with Proliferate, but this is what we get. The other one is a common, and it's weaker than this one. Um, it's only a draw 1 for 3, I believe. So I thought this was the best choice, and not running a full set of it either. Like I said, I didn't want to overwhelm things with Proliferate. If you didn't have enough to make it worthwhile, then it's kind of a dead mechanic. The other things that I brought in a 3 of Seal of Primordium. This can also be, I guess, used as Naturalize or something like that. But being a casual deck, I always like to have some kind of answer for enchantments and artifacts when available, because they are very prevalent. This was my choice because it was cheap. Naturalize is pretty cheap too, I guess. But this is what I had. This is what I wanted to play with. That's what I've been using. Excuse me. So now kind of an interesting choice. I wanted some land ramp. I am using 4 copies of the Heart Expedition. The reason I'm doing this is because it's pretty easy to build up off the landfall, but more importantly, it builds up through counters. So every time a land comes into play, you're putting a quest counter on the expedition, which means that it in turn works with the Proliferate ability. So you could put 1 counter on it, 2 counters on it, and then Proliferate to get that 3rd counter and accelerate your mana. Now, after playing this a lot recently, I may think it's a better idea to, in future playing, cut this down to a 3 of. If you get those in the mid to late game where you've kind of cut through most of your basic lands, and we're not running a ton of basic lands, we're running 10, so cutting that down to 3 is probably an acceptable thing. And at that point in time, you can feel free to bring in whatever you want, whether you want maybe a 4th Gambit, you want to bring in that 3rd Behemoth, something like that. It's definitely the first card I would cut, is reducing that to 3. When it comes to one last card I did miss. This is kind of an interesting addition. It came out in the recent set, Dark Ascension. I wanted to play with this as soon as I saw it. Saw a couple of these come by in drafts, grabbed them. Increasing Savagery, you pay 4, and you put 5 +1/+1 counters on a creature. When you flash it back for 7, it puts 10 counters instead. This is great. I love doing it. I really wish it was not specific to one creature, but that would probably make it a bit too powerful. If you could, divide up those counters, that would really make this deck. Excuse me, but it's definitely a great card. I have a lot of fun with it. This can be replaced. There are several options for spells that give +1/+1 counters in green. So you can keep an eye out. If you have something in your collection you would rather use, feel free. This was just my personal choice. I used to use the Green Decree at one point in time, which also gives counters, and the cycling ability will increase your ability to draw. So let's look at lands. I'm going to run 4 copies of the Land of War Reborn. It gives me just another Graft counter, which is always great. Terramorphic Expanse, because I like to thin out my lands. If you do for any reason get stuck on blue, you can you need to fetch out the frog or the Hydropon. You can do that. I am running a single copy of Auron Reef the Bastwood. This works great because all of your creatures are green, and this was introduced in Zen. You can tap and put a 1/1 counter on any green creature that has entered the battlefield this turn, which is great. Now you might think 1 is kind of an odd thing, that it won't come up that often, and that's reasonable and definitely true in some cases. But I really, this is an aggro deck. It wants to be aggressive. I really don't want to get stuck, at 3 lands, and then my 4th land is the Vastwood, so that it comes into play tapped. I'm already running 4 lands that are definitely coming into play tapped. I'm held up by Terramorphics, which come into play tapped. If you don't have the basics, your harbors are tapped. I really wanted this deck to be aggressive and not have to wait an extra turn to play my Rootkind or my Behemoth because I have a tapped land. Whenever possible, leave it open so that you can tap it to add the counters. But I like I said, I really didn't want to overwhelm this deck with a slow pace. So this is what I went with. Like I said, the harbors, you can feel free to change those out if the rising price is a bit much for you. But this is the deck I put together for Graft, so give it a try. Let me know what you think. And definitely check out the article and the other decks that I got here.